Okay, so let's get started with breaking down some of the pieces of the query objects VisualForce page that Ohad has created and been walking us through. So we're going to start by making a much more simplified version of this query object, or the object query page, so that we can get a little more granular about how some of these pieces work and how they fit together with some of the Apex that we have done in the past. So the page that we'll be creating, and let me confirm that everyone can see my desktop at this point.
I can see it.
Okay. So this is the full query objects page. And if you recall in this one, we can select from a list of Salesforce objects. And when we do that, it then populates the select fields to query based on that object. We get all of our account fields. And then we can put in a query value to look for particular values in those fields. But I'd like to have us build a simple version of this one. So first I'll show off this page and show you what we're going to all work on here. So this is a much stripped down version of the page, and all it's really doing is gathering the objects. And even just this very simple interface here has quite a lot of new things for us to explore and to really understand as we build up to the full VisualForce page. So what I'd like to now do is flip over to my developer console, and we'll do a little behind the scenes look. So the page that I just displayed, called this page, as you can see, is really pretty simple, just 11 lines. And even so, that only generates that very small box that we saw on the page that we still sort of see here around the corner. And then if we look at the underlying controller for this, you can see that it is also very stripped down. And what I'd like to walk everyone through doing is recreating these based on what we see in Ohad's object controller. So this is often a technique I use when I am working with someone else's code and I kind of need to understand how it fits together. I try to take it apart, make it simpler, and to be able to get each of the smaller parts working as I build up to the bigger whole. So I'd like everyone to also open up their developer console and get the Ohad's object controller and object query files open. Those should be available also on the gist. Ohad, if you're able to post a link to that, that would help everybody.
I'll post it in a second.
So what the approach I want us to take is to essentially copy from everything that's in the existing page and controller. We're going to put those in a new page and start taking away from them until we get down to that basic page. And then we can really take a look and understand each of the elements in the much simpler page. So to get started on that, it's good to start with, well, I guess in this case we can start with the controller rather than the page. The page depends on the controller, so if we try to create the page and tell it go to a particular controller that doesn't exist, VisualForce and Apex are going to barf up some problems, and we're just going to take it from the other approach. So let's start by creating a new Apex class. All VisualForce controllers are ultimately Apex classes. And I'm going to, I guess I'll call this that page, since I already used this page. I'll call it that page controller. And then I'm just going to copy everything except for the first line, since I don't want to get a conflict with the name, which is object query controller. If I copy everything else, though, I'll be able to keep my page name, or my class name, that page controller. And I think the only thing we're missing up there is the without sharing qualifier. And that without sharing just makes sure that regardless of our an org's role level security, record level security, and the roles sharing settings, that whoever's running this will get access to any records in the database, whether they can normally see them or not. With sharing, I believe, is the default. Is that correct, Ohad?
Yes.
Yeah, with sharing is the default.
Yes.
So if you are creating a VisualForce page that is perhaps pulling data that people normally cannot see, and you need them to see it in this particular page, you do have to explicitly add that without sharing into the first line of your controller class. All right, so what we're going to do now is, hey, we're going to look at the problem that cropped up. Something went wrong. Invalid constructor name. Okay. So this is a good first lesson about constructors. What we have is somewhere down here a constructor class. And constructor classes or constructor methods are methods within a class that must be named identically to the class they're in, because as soon as that class is touched by something like a VisualForce page or a trigger, the constructor class runs automatically. In this case, we don't actually necessarily, we might not need this, but I'm going to go ahead and just change this to match our class name. And get that saved. And once more, I've got one other error here. That looks like I've just got an extra curly brace here at the end, so I'll delete the extra one. Okay, so I've done that. Now I want everyone else to do the same. And when you have accomplished that, which hopefully won't take you very long, just drop the word done in our chat session. Or if you get an error and you're not sure how to do it, let us know about that, and we'll take a chance to really do some error troubleshooting, since that's always a crucial part of development. So go ahead and see if you can get the controller copied into a new controller, renamed, get the constructor renamed, and get your curly braces better aligned than mine. And if you're not playing along in the developer console at home, also just say done so we don't wait on everyone. I see Rick just said he's just going to be watching tonight and doing the exercises later on. Purnima said she's got it done. Just checking to see if anyone else is doing it. If all right, looks like we've got Jen Lee has got it done. Now, did anyone encounter any different errors than I got that they'd like to share? Certainly would like to be able to point those out to everybody so that we understand how to identify them. Seems like everyone got that easy step done. So now we're going to consider what we want to do and what we want to clear out. So going back to the original object query page that Ohad created and taking a look at it, we know that we're really just going to recreate this top section here, the one that gives us the list of object names. So that means that everything besides that, everything else that's in this page, we're not going to need. And so what we'll do is we'll now set up our VisualForce page and copy in just what we need from here. So once again, I will go to creating a new VisualForce page, and I'll call it that page. And then grab what I need from here. And in this case, we really just need that first section, the page block section, and then this, the most important part, this select list, because that's where we're going to try and get into our simplified page here. And I'm not even going to grab in this second block section since that starts with that's where we start getting the field selection. So I'll go ahead and copy this and put this in between. There it goes. Now, as soon as I get that in there, I immediately start getting some red flags coming up from the parser. It wants me to complete all of the tags that I opened. In the full page, there's some other information before them, but since we're just taking out a partial section, we kind of have to put those back in. So we can see we've got our Apex block section here, but it looks like the Apex page block is the next tag we need to close. And Developer Console conveniently auto-completes that for me. And then next, I need to get the Apex form. And now just to sort of tidy things up, I'm going to take out that blank row. And then I'll highlight everything. And with a Shift Tab, I'll get everything nicely aligned. And at this point, the only thing left to add in is just telling it where it's going to get information. So I'll have to add my controller here and tell it the controller is that page. And what problem am I missing here? Apex class that page does not exist. Oh, that's right. It's called that page controller. And looks like that's saved. All right, so now it is your turn to get this far. So once again, I will await your confirmations in the chat session that you have caught up with this section, and then we'll proceed from there. think we've got 2 done. And based on our first round, I think we're just waiting on the 3rd to get done. And then we will move along. Okay, everybody is caught up. At this point, because we have the entire controller from our original full controller, our page should be able to work because everything that it references here is still part of that controller. So we can hit the preview button, and that will open it up in our interface. And we can see we do, in fact, have that list of objects to query. And there's not any of the other aspects of it because our page doesn't have the page block section for selecting fields to query, or the query button, or the query value input text field. So what we're going to do next is we're going to start clearing stuff out of that controller class so that we can really whittle it down to just the bare bones that we need. So going back to the dev console, we could do this a couple of ways. We could just start deleting stuff from the controller and see if anything breaks, but that's certainly a valid way to proceed with reverse engineering, but we'll try to be a little more systematic than that. By really looking at what we have in here and what that tells us about what we need to keep in our controller. So if we start going through these line by line, we can sort of dissect what's happening in each of these different tags and tell which of them have information that references the controller and which of them do not. So our Apex form, there's really nothing in there. It's not referencing anything. It's just telling VisualForce that what's starting next is going to be a form, something where we might have inputs and outputs. Same with the next one, the Apex page block. All that really is doing is just has the parameter here to give that a title. That's this part that we see here, or more accurately, if we go to the actual page, this one. In fact, just to really connect the dots, we're going to change this to display objects since we're not really querying them at this point. And as soon as I do that and save it, because I have that page opened as a preview, we can see that the page in the background refreshes. So that's a nice convenience for quickly working on these. And we'll take a look at our next element here, the Apex page block section. Once again, it has a title, object selection. And we can see that showing up here as the section header. And by using a page block section, that's what gives us the drop-down arrow in VisualForce that allows that to be hidden or revealed. And really a great convenience in developing VisualForce that you don't have to include the necessary code that would provide interface actions like that. All right, so now we're starting to get into some tags here that do start to have references to our controller. How do we know? We see this particular pattern. So whenever we see that exclamation point within some curly braces, we can pretty well guess that that's going to be referencing something in our controller. There's a slight chance that it might just be a not operator reversing true to false or false to true, but 99% of the time it's going to be a clue that something is being referenced in our controller. The other things that we have in this one are just some further things to tell it what the size of it should be. So Ohad demonstrated last time that we can show more than one element in the pick list at a time. And if we look back here, we can now see that because we changed it from 1 to 3, our list is showing the top 3 elements in it. And we can scroll through the rest. But it's just a little more user-friendly, a better user experience if it's just showing one at a time. And of course, that's one of those developer decisions that you might make based on your knowledge of what your end users are going to be doing. Maybe there is a good reason to have multiple ones displayed simultaneously. And the same goes for whether you give this a title or not. So we could put in all objects as a title. Oops, and then you have to hit the correct key. And so now that I've given that a title, oh, I thought that was going to show up here. Well then, I'm just going to take that out altogether. Because like I said, we're trying to get this down to the bare minimum we need here. Okay, so there we now are back to our just select list displaying 1. All right, so now let's figure out what does this refer to. All right, so it's telling us that this is a reference to something called selected object. So if we go over to the controller, we're going to look for that selected object reference. So we'll start back up here at the top. And we can immediately see that there is a string instantiated here for select object with its getter and setter methods. So we know that's something that we want to keep. In fact, I'm just going to put a comment after that and say keep. This will allow me to remember that this is something that when I start getting rid of things, not to get rid of that. And going back to our VisualForce page, we'll take a look at the next element here. So the next option we've got is select options. And this is the apex tag that goes with select list to tell us what we're going to populate into that pick list. So these are all of the object names that come out of our database schema. So let's see if we can find that object names as well. And that is right above it. So I'll also put a keep right there. And then continuing our assessment here. All right, so the next thing we've got is an action support. So this piece does have some references, but we don't have the exclamation point and the curly braces that tells us that it's necessarily going to be referencing something in our controller. Rather, it is saying that it's waiting for certain actions to happen on that page, and those actions are defined by this parameter here for an onChange event. So it has this event that it's watching for, and when that event happens, it's going to initiate this command, which is a re-render. So why is that there? Well, if we look back at the original page, that was there because if we change the object we're looking at from account to, how about asset, we need this page on the change of the value here to re-render the list of fields, because now it's showing us the asset fields. But our page doesn't have this section. We're not actually going to be doing that, so we can say that that line we don't even really need in our simplified VisualForce page. So I'm just going to take that line out altogether. And then the final unidentified tag we have here is the output label. that's just some basic text for our that precedes our field, this text here. And well, that doesn't have any references, so we're just going to leave that as is. So all we really ended up doing was just identifying two references in our controller and one tag, the action support tag, that we're not going to need anymore. So I'll let everyone get caught up and make those changes to their VisualForce page. And then we will move on to starting to clean out our controller and make sure that it still works with our simplified page. And 2 out of 3 done. While we're waiting for the third, I'm curious. So we've got the output label here. We got rid of our title. I'm curious what happens if we leave the title in there and use it instead of an output label. I don't actually know what's going to happen here, so I am not advocating that everybody does the same. But a little experimentation is always a good way to learn. So let's see what happens now. So we get no title on that. So it seems the only way to really get that in there is to have that output label. So why don't I just get rid of that and get this back to the previous state in which it has the call to action for our users to tell them what they should do with our pick list. Okay, so now we've got our page nice and simplified, and now most of our further editing is going to take place in our controller. So going back over to our controller, get a little more real estate here. So we know that the things that we really need are the object names and the selected object string. The object names is a kind of special type of data type. So I mean, the data type for selected object, really simple string. That's just going to be account or asset, whatever gets selected in the pick list. But the data type for object names is a list of select options. Now, if you recall from when we were working with Apex, we would create lists of other types of data types. It might be a list of strings or integers. It might be a list of accounts. In this case, it's a specialized data type particularly for VisualForce called select options. That informs VisualForce when it's showing a drop-down list that it's going to have a particular data type to populate those with. And that's pretty much going to be strings in all cases. But select option is how VisualForce knows that these strings should be part of a pick list. So what we need to start doing now is to figure out where what these two particular variables, object names and selected objects, connect to down below. So conveniently, when we highlight select option, we start to see other locations that have similar, that have the exact same name. So I'm going to use that same feature of Developer Console to help me find where object names gets referenced. Somewhere we know that that list of object names is getting populated. So I'll now start to scroll through my list, or through my lines of code here. And there it is. Okay, so I see it's referenced in my Developer Console is doing this weird jumping around thing. That seems to be a bug that it caught during the spring release. So I'm just going to use my cursor to try and avoid that behavior. All right, so here's where we saw object names referenced. And it's referenced here in our constructor. And that constructor, again, is the method within our controller class that runs as soon as the controller is instantiated. How did our controller get instantiated? Simply by loading our VisualForce page. As soon as we load it, the reference in the page at the top tells us that the controller is called that page controller, and that instantiates our controller class. It triggers it. It runs it. There's a lot of different ways to express that. And as soon as it does that, it looks for a constructor class. A constructor class is, our constructor method is named exactly the same as the class and just has these empty parentheses after it. And then it just executes everything in here. And the first thing that it executes is populating object names. That was the list of all of the objects. Now where does it get those? Well, we see that it's saying to call this init object names method. So following our clues through our class here, we now know that we need to look for init object names. So I highlight that, and sure enough, we get down here and we see we have another method here. So I've got a few more things now that I know I need to keep. So once again, I'm going to use this quick comment to tell me this is something I need to keep, as well as the method that it calls. And in fact, since we need this whole method, I'm just going to put that before the method. And in fact, I could even put another one here that says end keep. Maybe I'll make that start keep and end keep. There we go. Now I know that I'm going to need this whole piece. Why do I know that? Well, simply because the init object names method is one discrete chunk of code. And I'm sort of guessing that I'll probably need everything it does, because I kind of expect that the only thing this does is get our list of fields. We'll take a deeper look at that a little later. But, well, actually, I guess what we need to do now is probably go through this and see if this has any further dependencies within the code that might tell us we need something to keep. So if we look at this method, we're seeing, all right, so what is it telling us here? Well, it's telling us first that it's private. All that really means is that this particular method is only accessible within this class, or that page controller. More importantly, it's telling us that it's going to return a list of select option. Aha! So that's connecting everything back to that very first line we had up here, where we have an empty list of select options called object names. So we instantiated that as an empty, list. Our constructor said, go ahead and use this method when we open this class. And then this method is actually going to populate that. So whatever it's doing, it's ultimately going to return a list of select options. That could be anything. It could just be a list of strings or integers, but we know, because we know what we're building here, that it's going to be objects from our schema. And if we look a little further into this, we can see how it's doing that, which can also tell us, is there some other stuff we need to keep here? So let's drill into this and see what we've got here. So our first line in this method looks like it's just creating another empty list, calling it object names. And it creates it as an empty list using our pretty standard format where we define that it's a list, what type of data is in it. We give that list a name, and then we simply have to reiterate that this is a new list. It's not something we've created before. We've had other ones, but this one is called object names. And then the next thing we see is now we are creating a list of strings, and we're giving that the name entities. And then once again we have our new list and string, but instead of creating this as an empty one, we're populating it with a schema map and the key set of the schema map. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, where is this schema map coming from? Where did that get defined? Well, I guess we'd better try and find that. So I'm going to use another technique here. I'm going to use the search capability in Developer Console by hitting Command F or Control F and typing that in. And now I can hit Enter, and it's going to show me where else the schema map occurs. Aha! So as soon as I do that, I see at the very top we have defined that there. So schema map is a variable name referencing something else. So that's another keeper. And now if we want to figure out what that's doing, we can sort of look at this. We go, all right, well, so we called something schema map. What did we call schema map? Well, rather intuitively, it is in fact a map. And it's a map that maps some string to something that here is listed as schema S-object type. And then if we look what is in that, we can see that it's using schema.getGlobalDescribe. So now we could ask ourselves, is this something that's happening in our code? Maybe. So why don't we try and find that again? In fact, I'll just copy that and put that in my search here. So let's see if that's something that is coming from our code. As I try and search through it, I get this is the only instance of that particular reference. So it means it's not a method in here. So we go, well, it's not in our class here. Is there a schema class? Well, we haven't created one. So at this point, we can kind of guess, well, if we didn't create it and it's not part of any of our custom code, that's probably some type of provided class by Salesforce. And in fact, it is. I'm not going to go too deep into what schema gets global describe is at this point, because what we've done is we've told us, all right, we don't need to look any further. We know that this is something coming from outside, provided by Salesforce, so we can get back to figuring out what here in our code we need to keep. So sort of tracing ourselves back, we got all involved with this schema map line because we were looking at our constructor here that sent us into this method. And yep, doing that jumping around thing again. Bear with me while I get control of my developer console here. All right, we're in this init object names, and it was right here that we went off on that chase to schema map. So now we know that what's happening now is when we get to this line, where we said we have a list of strings, and we're going to call it entities, and we tell it this is a new list, but this list should be populated from this schema map.keyset. Cool, so that's how that's getting populated. And then moving on to the next line, we see, well, we're referencing that list of strings called entities, and we're just using the very simple sort method on that. It's a list of strings, and just like we were in a spreadsheet, if we sort a list of strings, it's going to arrange them alphabetically for us. So that's all this is really doing. It's getting whatever that list of strings is and sorting them alphabetically. We know ultimately that that list is supposed to be a list of all the objects in our Salesforce data schema, and that's why we see things like accepted, event relation, and account, and all of these in nice alphabetical order. Is that absolutely necessary? Probably not, but this is going to be a long list, and it'll make life a lot easier on our users to guarantee that it comes back in a human-friendly order. All right, so now we've got that list sorted. The final thing that is happening here is a short little for loop. And that for loop is going through that list of entities. Our for loop syntax is that we tell it for one thing in a group of things, do something. In this case, that group of things is our entities list of strings, and those one things are going to be strings. And we're going to call each of those a name as we loop through them in our for loop. So let's see what we are doing with it. So we see here that now we're referencing that list of select options called object names. And as we go through that list in entities, we're going to add to that list of select options by telling it, create a new select option. And each of those select options should just reference that name string. Now, the format of select option is such that it actually requires 2 entries. And this is something we're not as familiar with from the declarative interface, where when we create a pick list, there's really just one value. It's whatever that pick list item is here. Conceivably, in our select options and our Apex select lists, we could have a name that is displayed kind of like a label, and then we could have an underlying name, which is more like, say, an API name. So that way we might have reasons for showing one thing, perhaps a very user-friendly label, and then actually have it return a different value. For example, we could conceivably have a list of state names where we have things like Arkansas as the label, and then just have it return, oh, this is a good one, I think it's AK. And then perhaps another one would be Alaska, and that would return, gosh, I'm not even sure, I think Alabama's AL. So this is exactly why you might want to have a long friendly name coupled to the less well-known abbreviations in a list. But for our purposes here at the object names, we're pretty content to just be able to return the same thing for both. So it goes through that whole loop, finding each object in entities, and then adding it to our select options. And finally, the part with which Apex will not let you complete this method unless you have a return command. And this is what tells it, remember this up here where you said you're going to give back a list of select options? Well, this is where it's coming from. And in fact, one of the frustrating things when you are returning something is the return has to be the last line. So you start writing out your code, and until you have added that line, you're going to keep getting an error message here that says non-void method might not return a value or might have a statement after a return statement. So if you are writing a method that is expecting to return a value, sometimes it's best to put in that final line first. I guess I have that in my buffer. No, I don't. Looks like I'll just have to type this out the hard way. Return object names. Type that in first, perhaps even before you add in all of the middle parts, just so you're not getting that error message. And that way, if something else, the parser catches something else, you'll be alerted to that, not this one that's really kind of obvious and easy to resolve. All right, so what have we got done to this point? We figured out that this is this list of init object names was almost completely self-contained. It just had this list of schema map. We traced that, and we figured out schema map is where that particular aspect of our code ends. It goes and gets that. It doesn't reference anything, so we don't need to keep anything other than that reference to it back on line 3. Okay, so in our continued hunt through what we have to keep here, and I should also mention that while we're doing this under the guise of trying to simplify this class for just our particular purposes, the same method or procedure for trying to figure out what's happening in code is what you might end up doing if you're troubleshooting someone else's code. So there's a couple of lessons here in what we're doing, not just here for VisualForce, but also really just how you work with others' code. You might be getting an error message that you're expected to solve, and you have to drill into their Apex class, and you kind of have to start in a similar method of trying to break down, follow from where a variable gets referenced to a method, to what that method is calling. It can be really tedious. And certainly doing something like this is some practice at how to at least get there a little faster. And ways of doing that are leaving yourself a trail of comments like breadcrumbs to help you find your way back out of the forest. And you can even make these more verbose. That helps you remember why you saved it. So in fact, now that we solved where the object names come from, I am going to make this more verbose. I'm going to say keep this comes from Constructor, and I think it was called init object names method. And I'll say that I'll keep this one because it's called by init object names. This way, if I look at it again, I don't have to remember that. I just know that's where it came from. So we trace down object names. So now we are left with selected object. And we can see whether we need to keep this and what exactly that means. So now let's go back to that page and see exactly what that string was supposed to be doing. So we look here, and we see that select list was referencing this list of selected objects, and that's what it was getting the value. But we can also ask ourselves, well, what was the purpose of this? Because now that we've done this and looked a little further, we see that because we did the object names, we knew that, well, that's where we're getting our objects. So what is the point of selecting an object here? We're not doing anything with it. Now on OHA's original code, there was a reason to do that. We selected the object, and then that selected object was being used to get our list of fields for that object. But for this simple page, we don't care. We're not getting that list of fields. So we might even be able to say, maybe we don't need this at all. Let's just take a quick look in our code and see what's that doing. Do we actually need that? So we look here at selected object, and we start to see what it's doing. And it says, like here we have a reference to it and a comment. If an object was not selected yet, just populate the text select object first. Well, I think that was part of the, we can see here that that particular reference is here in this method called getObjectFields. And that's, that one is the one that actually makes that list of fields. We probably don't need that. So I'm starting to get the sense as I look through this that selected object, like here it is again, here it's getting the fields. We don't care. We're not getting the fields here in our simple one. In fact, I think we can say we don't need that at all. In fact, we're going to test that. So let me save my controller here to get it up to date. And let's see what happens if I just take this out. So the page saves fine. And I look back here at my VisualForce page. I'm still getting that whole list. Yeah, it turns out that was something that is part of the bigger picture, but we really didn't need it here anymore. So at this point, we've actually whittled down our controller. We've labeled everything that we need. So at this point, we can really start to say, all right, well, then we've got a lot of stuff in here we no longer need. In fact, most of these things we declare up here we don't need. Now the tricky part at this point is if you just start deleting things, you're going to hit all sort of dependencies. So if I try to get rid of one of these lines here, it's probably going to tell me there's something referenced down below. In fact, let's just see what happens here. So if I try to delete this particular string because I believe it's not something I need to keep, I delete that one, and I try and save. Maybe I'll get lucky here and it's not referenced. Nope, it's not. Not going to be the case. It tells me that the variable no longer exists, selected field. So I look down here and see, all right, so I guess it's part of this. Well, we know that this was the button, so you know what? Let's just get rid of that whole thing. We know we don't need, in fact, we know we don't need anything that we didn't label to keep. So at this point, we can just start clearing out all sort of stuff that we no longer need. But that's a good comment. That's telling us what's happening in our section there. So this other method in here, in fact, this is a good time to start using these arrows along the side because they'll help us to collapse what we do want to keep, our constructor. And now I get this small little glowing purple thing that says there's more code in here, and if you need to see it, you just have to expand over here. I also identified that I want to keep this particular method. So I'll click on that, and collapse that down. So now I've managed to whittle this down a bit to just those parts that I care about here, which means pretty much anything else I can get rid of. So this whole method, getObjectFields, see if I'm making sure I know where the end of it is here. So I put my cursor there, right after the declaration of that method's name, getObjectFields. And I can see it ends on line 40. So I'm just going to ditch that whole section now. And now that we've gotten rid of those methods and anything that might be a dependency, now I can probably start to get rid of some of this stuff. And it looks like this part's not needed. And public list of contacts, I don't even know why that was there. So we're just really stripping this down to its bare essentials. Now, I don't expect it's going to be all that easy. Certainly it says that there's something else that I left in there. Let's pop back open our constructor to see line 11. Looks like there was some other stuff in the constructor that we left in there. Let's just get that out. And we did not see any of those, so now I think we've gotten this down to the bare essentials of what we need to just have a list of accounts, or I mean a list of all of our objects in Salesforce. All right, so I know that was a lot of sleuthing around and a lot of listening on your part. So now it's your chance to do a little destructive programming. I'll go ahead and leave mine up here on the screen so that you have something to refer to and you don't necessarily have to go through that same trail that I went through. But now I'd like you to start stripping out the unnecessary code from your controller class, as well as getting rid of that extra value reference that we originally had here in our select list. That was the object fields. So go ahead and give that a try. And as you go through that, if you hit any unexpected errors that you can't immediately identify, let's bring those up and we'll take a look at those and see if we can't help everybody to understand what the error is, what's causing it, and how to get rid of it. So I'll give everybody a few minutes and let me know when you have caught up by dropping a done in the chat.
Hey, look, you can check out our chat for a moment.
Okay. 2 out of 3 done. And looks like we're all caught up. So I'm going to just take a quick 5-minute wrap up here and hand this back over to Ohad. And in our wrap up, I want to take a look at some of the things we glossed over, particularly this schema get global describe. So let's go ahead and Google this, because we said that we figured out this is not something we wrote. And when we do a Google on it, it shows us that it does in fact come from the provided library, the schema class. And we can see that get global describe method, so I'll click through to that. And this is a method the Salesforce library of methods provides that returns a map of all the S-object names. And that map is returned, it tells us here, as the key is the S-object name, and the value, the key and the value pair, is the S-object token. So that just means it's basically giving us the object name, say account, and then the object type. And that's, we were not as concerned about getting that real S-object type as we really were about just getting that string name. So that's why when we got that map of object names to object types, down here where it was called, we used that map method of key set to get just all of the strings, all of the keys in our map. So even though it started as a map, it then just takes all of the strings, which are just a list of strings, and that's what populated that list of strings. So that's how we were able to pretty easily get all of our object names out of our Salesforce schema. And then just quickly looking at the other key pieces that we have left here, we just had our list of select options, the object names. That's what populated that list on our page. And actually, we kept something here we didn't need. This was the selected object that we took away from our VisualForce page. So there's something else that we no longer need. So we were really able to whittle down that big page to just a much more easily understood part of our bigger picture, and really be able to trace a little more easily through this. So now that you've had a chance to sort of break this down in particularly deep and slow fashion, I'm going to hand this over to Ohad, who's going to, instead of taking us backwards like I just did, take us forwards into some more VisualForce. Ohad, take us forward.
Okay, just give me 1 second. I'm just trying to do one tiny tweak that will hopefully even make it nicer. So just give me exactly 1 second.
And I'm curious, what happens if we take out this sorting? See how messy the return is. All right, so what do we get now? Oh yeah, now instead of being sorted alphabetically, it's just returned in by who knows what order. Parker Harris probably knows why they're in this order and no one else. So that's exactly why giving a sort is nice. So I'm just going to put that back. There it goes.
Are you okay with me taking over, Luke?
Go for it.
Okay. So hopefully you guys can see my screen now.
Yes, I can.
Okay. So, Luke, thank you very much for taking us through that. I hope that made it a little easier to see what we did so far. And with that, I wanted to start and look at the to-do list that we discussed in our last session. And I've gone ahead and started to add some of the functionality. I haven't really shared this code in Gist yet, but I will share that at the end of this session. So for now, we'll actually just take the time to look at what I've done and how, and you'll just follow up with me, hopefully. So with that, we'll start. So if we look at our code, where's my, sorry. This is what I'm looking for. So some of the to-dos that we've identified last time was to be able to select multiple fields. And we wanted to look at like error handling and queries of fields that are different than text. We looked at selecting multiple fields, mass updates, and inserting of new records. So what I decided to start tackling is actually the selection of multiple fields. And with that, let me start by showing you what I have done, and then we'll look at what. So if you remember, first of all, as Luke just showed us, the select field to query was just a single pick list, so we could only have picked one item, one field. So when I select an object now, I actually made it into a bigger pick list, and I've also enabled a multi-pick on it. So that means I can select as many fields as I want from here. And at that point, I'll click the Add Fields button, which now adds the fields that I selected into the right side of the screen. I can actually select more fields. So let's say I'll select this one again, and I'll add type this time. I click Add Fields. So we see that only type was added because master record ID was already selected. And we can basically continue and add as many fields as we want to this query. What I've also done is enable the ability to create an operator. So we can query based on very specific, basically we can either leave each one of these fields as, hey, just show me this field, or we can also say, I want to use this also as a query restriction, as a criteria. Now, I just tried to do something and it failed. So if I click the query button right now, it actually will break the page. Let me just put some things back. I'll comment this thing out. And let's just leave this for now. So this should at the very least allow me to query. Now, of course, because I had opened my page by clicking preview from the developer console, that means that every time that I save a new version, the page automatically gets refreshed. So because I saved a change to refresh the page, I'll just go back here. I'll select some things here, add fields. The only problem is right now, I am only displaying two fields, ID and what was that? And name. So even if I use this criteria will actually work, but I will only be displaying apparently I won't. Okay. So before we even get to the queries part, let's start by looking at really how this page works, what I've done so far on this page. So basically we know that when we select the account, the list of fields is queried, And this is basically what we've done before. There's really no change in that area. So let's start to look at the code, and we'll start with the controller. I added a few new variables that we are going to need. The first one is a list of something called field wrapper. And we'll talk about that in a second. The second is just a set of strings, and the third is another list of strings. So let's look at this public list of field wrapper. So this is something that is going to be, I assume, new again. So we always used to reuse list of account or list of case or list of string or a list of integers. And those are all data types that are defined in Apex, right? So some of them can be objects and some of them can be data types like integer, string, and so on. With Apex, we also have the ability to define custom classes. And those custom classes can represent data in a structure that we can define in our code. So if I just scroll down a little bit, we see here something called a public class. And the name of the public class is field wrapper. So what's interesting here is that basically what I'm doing here, I'm creating a list of this class. And when we look inside this class, I see that we've defined a string called field name, another string called query operator, another string called query value, and then I have a public field wrapper, which is the same as the name of the class. Now, where have we seen calling a class that has the same name, an entity that has the same name as the class? This is exactly the same as looking at our public class and looking at our, if this stops jumping, constructor. So we know that the constructor runs every single time that the class is initiated or instantiated, which means for what we've seen so far, when the page loads, the page relies on this class. And so it instantiates this class, at which point the constructor will run. What we are doing here with the custom class, we're actually doing exactly the same thing. That means every time we instantiate an entity of field wrapper, we will run this class's constructor. So to kind of summarize this, I've created a custom class within my controller class. I've defined 3 strings in this case, or 3 variables, and I created a constructor. The constructor will run when we instantiate a new field wrapper. So in this case, you can see that the constructor accepts a string. It sets the field name to the string that has been provided, and sets the 2 other variables as null. So if I just take a moment away and I just say inside my constructor, let's say I was walking inside my constructor now, in the class constructor. You know, let me just make it easier. I'll actually go to the class constructor. So let's go to the class constructor. And what I could do here, I could basically instantiate a new entity of my class. Just like I instantiate a new object or instantiate a new integer or variable, I'm now saying I want a new field wrapper. And so I can give it a name, field wrapper, let's say. And I say it's a new field wrapper. And again, that's the same notation that we've all worked with forever, right? It's just the only new thing here is that we're using something called a custom class. And just like we instantiate any other thing, I can just say field wrapper FW is a new field wrapper. Now, I'm actually getting an error here, and it's saying the constructor is not defined. And the reason is that my constructor expects a string. And so if I just go to my constructor again, and I just add a string here, and I save it, it's good. It's all good now. And so I just created this field wrapper, right? And let's do something simple, system debug of this FW. So we'll ignore everything else that is happening, right? I'm going to refresh my page, and when my page refreshes, this constructor is going to run. All of these things are beautiful, but we don't care about them for the purpose of just explaining the wrapper class. All I care about is to see what happens when I instantiate a new field wrapper and what's the end result. So with that, I'll refresh this page. And let's look at the debug log. If I look at my debug log, we see here this is line 90. Is this the right line? Yes. So here's my debug statement saying this is the field wrapper that you just created. And we can see that just like an object that has 3 fields in it, the field wrapper was instantiated with 3 values in it. Field name, which received that value that I passed in, query operator, which received a null value, and query value, which received a null value. So an easy way to think about custom classes is almost like saying, hey, I want to create or define a new object. And I want this object to have these fields. And the reason that I'm doing it as a custom class and not as an actual object in Salesforce is that this structure may only be something that I care about for the purpose of this program that we're doing, this page, for example. Right, so there's really no point in creating an object, but at the same time, there's a purpose or there's a value in having this type of structure when a record or entity of this class can have different values that are related to each other.
And is it kind of like creating like a child custom object that within this class we could have multiple different custom class records within it? Mm-hmm. If we just pass in a different string each time we create a new one?
I mean, that's exactly it, right? I can create, and we'll see this in a moment. Right now I just created a single field wrapper, but I can create a list of field wrappers, right? And I'll just say it's a new list of field wrapper. I think that should allow me to create it because I'm not actually instantiating individual field wrappers, just a list. Now, of course, this doesn't exist anymore. But I can now say fwlist.add new field wrapper, some string, and I can now add another one, another string. right? So I basically have a list now with two entities in it of field wrapper. Okay, there we go. And if we try to instantiate, actually the page already got instantiated because when I save the change in the class, the page automatically refreshes. So I have this already, this log. And we can see now that the field wrapper is a list, and it has the first entity, sum string, query operator, and query value, and then another field wrapper with another string, query operator, and value. So just again, just like a list of accounts or a list of cases or whatever, we can create a list of these custom classes. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, I sort of understand this, but why would I ever want to use this? I think the simplest example I can give is a list. You know what? Let me tell you even better than that. Let's look at accounts for a second. When I go to a list view, and I see all of these accounts, right? We already know that we can very easily display a list of values in VisualForce. But I want to also select them. Now, when you create a list in Salesforce, in your Apex, and you want to display it in your VisualForce and then do something with the selected accounts, how can you identify if your accounts were selected or not? So the most common solution is to create what we call a wrapper class, a class that wraps around our account. And so just as an example of how something like this will look, so I will start by saying, public class account wrapper class. And I will define here a Boolean, and I will call it selected. And we probably want to make it public so that it's available from the screen. And then I will also say public account. And then we can have, of course, our constructor. That maybe will accept account. I will say selected. Maybe it will be false by default. And account equals A. And so now when I create a list, let's say I have in my actual account wrapper, in my actual code, I create a list of accounts, right? A list, but instead of a list of accounts, I'll create a list of account wrapper class. I hope that I'm not digging myself. I may be digging myself into a deeper grave than I need to be at this point. But basically, I will create, let me just think what's the best way to describe this. As I add accounts to my wrapper class, I'll probably start with a list of account, and I'll say select ID name from account. And then I will go through a loop, and I will say we would also create a list of account wrapper class. I think I'm going way deeper than I need to. So I'll just kind of finish my current train of thought, and then we'll go back to what we're doing. But basically, so now I queried a list of accounts, and I say for each account, we can say account wrapper dot add new account wrapper class of A. So essentially what I'm doing here, okay, I queried a bunch of accounts, and now I want to create a wrapper class for them. And the wrapper class will have just two values. One is the checkbox, is the Boolean to identify if we selected it or not. And the second value is the actual account. And what that allows me to do is when I display it on the screen, I can show a value, I can keep a value of selected that's related to my account. So again, I think I dug myself way in deeper than I should have, and I hope I did not. I probably confused everybody a lot more by doing that. But let's just go back here. So what was the purpose of this entire thing? Why did I want to keep this? I wanted to create, does anybody, by the way, does everybody experience this issue where since the Spring 17 release, when you navigate your thing, just your developer console just jumps around?
Yes, it's been making me crazy. This happened about 2 years ago. It was a bug that they used to have in there, and
I remember that.
The only way I deal with it is just dropping my cursor in, and instead of scrolling, I just arrow key my cursor around.
Yeah, that doesn't even always help with this. I remember last time it happened, but now even when I use my cursor, it will still jump sometimes. But it's just insane. So hopefully they will fix this soon. But I will use my cursor. The reason I created this wrapper class is because I wanted to be able to keep a specific field that we selected, identify an operator for this field, and assign it a value, a query value. Right? So if we look at our page, that is exactly what we see in this table here. Right? So when I selected my fields, I basically created entities in my wrapper class list. So let's see how that works.
I mean, it's kind of like recreating what we get in reports when we can add multiple filters, each one for a field where we get an operator that we can use specifically for that field, and then a specific query value for that operator for that field.
Exactly. That's exactly the idea, right? I mean, that's what I was trying to replicate here, either reports or list view kind of thing, right? And where I really want to get with this page in the end, I think what we can end up this page with is a page that allows us to pick any objects we want in our organization and select whichever fields we want in that object, set any criteria that we want on any one of those fields, and finally be able to do a mass update on all of these fields, on all of these records that get created or that get queried. So it's kind of like a do-it-all mass update tool that you can just update any kind of record you want in your system. So that's hopefully where we'll be able to get in a couple more sessions. But for now, we are basically in the section of defining or building our complex query. So let's look at what happens, what is different from what happened before. So we talked a little bit about what the field wrapper is, and let's go back to our constructor. The only thing that I changed in our constructor is that I instantiated two more values, two more variables. The first one is called field queries, which we defined above, and it's a new list of our field wrapper. And the second one is a set of fields, a set of strings really that we use selected fields. On the page, all that I've changed at this point is I've gone to our pick list, which was before size of 1, and this one was not true. This wasn't here. If I save this now, the page will look exactly like it looked before, right? all I've done here is I changed this to show multi-select is true and show me 10 values. I could just as easily have 15. What did I break? Oh, this thing. Okay, it's saved. So this page automatically gets refreshed. And now we have a list of 15 fields here. And so as far as what happens when the page loads, as far as what we can see, all that I've changed so far is this. If we go back to the page now, I've created a new button, a new command button called Add Fields. It calls a class called button add fields, and it re-renders a section called selected field section. So let's look at what button add fields does. Okay, actually, I'm sorry. I did do something else, one more thing. Originally, we had a variable here called selected field. It was a string called selected field. In fact, if I go back to my, I think I closed my gist. I apologize. Let's go back to the gist. Originally, we had a string called selected field. What I've done now is I change it to a list of strings called selected fields with an S, because now on my page I don't only want to select one, I want to select multiple. So whenever you go into a page and you use multi-select equals true, the variable where you store your selections has to be a list. And that makes sense, right? If multi-select was false, basically saying, hey, I can only select one, I only need a string to store the result. But if I'm saying I can select multiple, I have to provide a list so I can store all of my results. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward. So let's go back now. Now that I remembered one more thing I changed, let's go back to our button add fields. And it's a very simple, straightforward method. The first thing I say is only do this if I selected more than 0 fields. So in other words, if I just refreshed my page now, selected account, and I click add fields, it doesn't do anything. But if the selected field size is bigger than 0, let's go and iterate through each one of those selections. Right, so our selection is the selected fields is that list that contains all the fields we selected in our multi-select pick list. And I'm iterating through each one of them. And I'm saying if the selected field set is null, or selected field set or the selected field set does not contain the current string, then add it to my set and add it to my wrapper list. So why am I doing this check? First of all, I'm saying if it is null. So I'm saying, hey, if that list of selected fields, if that set of selected fields is null, go ahead. If it's null, if it is null, that means that we have not yet made any selections. So when I load my page, that set that I created of strings is null. When I click add fields the first time, as it iterates to the first selection, the selected field set is null, in which case it will add it to the set and also add it to my list of wrappers. Why do I need a set and a list of wrappers? This is where I use this thing. I use my set to prevent duplicate selection. In other words, if I remove this OR statement, I select account here. I select account name and account type. Oh, in fact, if I do that, I have to completely comment this because it will only be null for the first one. But because I removed the use of the set, I could add this one many, many times as I want. So by using a set, we know that sets always have only unique records, unique values. So I'm essentially saying, hey, if it's empty, then fine, go ahead and add it. If it's not empty, at the very least, we want to say that it doesn't already contain that value. So if it already contains the value, I don't want to add it one more time. But if it's null or it doesn't contain, then we add that to the set so that we can avoid duplicating it next time. We click the button. And then we are adding our field queries, which is that wrapper class. And I'm instantiating a new wrapper class with that field name as the string that I'm passing in. And so what happens right now, let's add a little, and again it jumped. Come on. This is one of the most frustrating experiences. Okay, let's just add a little debug statement here. And as my page reloads now, so I just clicked on the add button. Let's look at that debug statement, how it looks. So you can see that it created a field wrapper list. The first one is account name, and those two are null. The second one is the parent account ID. These two are null. Now, because we are still in the same context, if I go ahead and add this one, and I click add, I can look at my debug, my new debug log. And I can see that now this list has more values. And in fact, you can see that query operator already got this value none, because on the page, it was the list that was instantiated with the value none. So when I clicked add again, it updated this to none. But that doesn't really matter for our purposes. But you can see also on 107, the only one that I selected, if we look at the code again, the only one that was actually being added to the list on the second time I clicked the button, inside this loop, the only one we added on the second time is billing list, billing city. Whereas on the first time, I added account name and parent account. So, again, I know this is a bunch of new concepts at the same time, but I would absolutely like to pause at this point and ask if anybody has any questions about this.
So, Ohad, if you wanted to sort the fields,
I'm sorry?
do you just use that whole, similar to what we did before with the entity sort?
Is it Jennifer?
Yeah.
What were you asking?
So
you were breaking up a little bit.
If you wanted to sort the fields for query so it's alphabetical and not in, I think it's like all the standard fields and then the custom fields or something.
Yep. If I
you
wanted
would use
to sort
that same,
in
same
fact,
syntax that we used earlier.
which one?
I think where we
She's
had like
referring
entity sort. Something
when we did the
similar.
entity sort on the object names returned by the schema get described.
That's exactly it. Yes, you're right. So I could go to my, but yeah, you're absolutely correct. Wherever I get those get object fields, But instead of returning this, I could say fields dot sort. And so now, when we look at accounts, now they're sorted alphabetically. Is that what you were asking, Jennifer?
Yes, I was. Thank you.
Okay, great. But that's a great idea because that makes it a lot easier. You're right. To generally, the fields are returned in the order of the field ID, and that is obviously incremental. So the standard fields are always going to be first, and then the fields you create by the order you created them. So it's not even going to be alphabetically for the custom fields. So that's a good idea always to sort it because obviously it would make it a lot easier to find. But okay, so by now what we have is a list of these wrapper classes that have the field names, contain some kind of an operator, and potentially even a value. Right? Let's just look at how I did this operator thing. So we see that this is basically a pick list, which we already know how to create a custom pick list with our own values. So what I've done here is I've actually created a new list. I call it get operators. And you can see I created a list of select options just like we've done before. But instead of trying to query them from somewhere, I literally added all of the different operators that I wanted to be available. And what you can notice here is that unlike previous time, I actually have different value from the display text. So where it displays equals, the value that will actually get passed into the controller is this. When I select greater than, the value that will get picked as the selection is actually bigger, the sign bigger than. So that is why, if I just do another one right now, and we look at the debug log, you can see that this wrapper class now actually has field name, account name. Query operator is equals to that bigger than sign. I'm sorry, bigger or equal. Query value is 1 to 3. And then I have my next field, account rating, also bigger or equal. And the value is 3 to 1, and so on. Right here I have the operator is equal, and the value 543. And of course, the last one that we've added only has null values currently. So hopefully you're starting to see the value of creating this custom class where I can actually create whatever data structure that I want. I can keep a field name together with some values that I decide that I should have for the purpose of my program. But of course, it wouldn't make any sense for me to create an object just for the purpose of this program. Okay, we'll try to get through a couple more things. We're almost at the end of our hour. So let's look at the changes that we've made to the queried, to the button query. And basically, all we will do right now is we won't display the results yet. If you remember, I only display the results if queried equals true, so I'm commenting this one out. And so when we go to the page now, and I select whatever fields I want, and I query, then to dereference a null object, line 131. Oh, yeah. That is still a bit broken. That was what I was trying to fix before Luke ended his part. But I can do this, query, and of course nothing happens on the screen right now because I did not tell it that queried is true, but I do have some things to show you. If I look at my debug statement now, we actually can see our final query string says select name, phone, account source, active, from account. Now, if I even go further and I say account name equals test, and phone number, of course, well, maybe we should have something that is a number, like I think we have employees. Let's say greater than 1. Currently, I broke this. So I can say account ID equals, oh, I know why. I have to use quotes. I haven't built that one yet. But I can say greater than 1, and I'll say query. And of course, that didn't work either. Okay, let's not dig into that issue right now. But we can see that we actually have a final query string saying select ID, account number, site, active, where this is exactly the fields that I selected from account where ID equals test and number of employees. I'm missing the bigger than 1. That's why that query failed. So let's look at how we did that. We made some changes to our button perform query. So everything these are pretty much the old code. In the old code, I had all the field names hard-coded. And I just added one more field name from that one select box that we had. And then I had the from and the object name and the field, when I had only one where statement that was based on my selected field and one criteria. But now we have multiple fields, we have multiple criteria, and some may not even have criteria. So let's look at this. I created 2 strings here. One is the query fields, and one is the query where string. So I'm going to build a list of fields that we want to query, and separately I'm going to build a list of where criteria. Okay? So I'm starting to go through my wrapper class now. The wrapper class we know has all the fields and all of the values that we selected for the operator and for the criteria for the query. And so the first thing I say is if the query fields is null, basically if we have not added any fields to our string yet, then I want to add the field name, the API field name of the field name in our wrapper class. So hopefully you guys remember this method. We used this before. I'm sorry, the map that we used. We used it even in our class last session, right? So this basically returns the API name of a label of a field. So I'm saying add to our list of fields, add the name of the first field. And if it's not null, meaning if we already had a field, I'm going to take the original value, meaning let's say the first field that was added. I'm going to add a comma, and then I'm going to add the next field name. So this is very simple. I'm going through all of my field names. The first one obviously doesn't need a comma before it. But every other field, we're just going to add to the existing list of fields and add a comma between the existing list and the new field we are adding. And then I do something fairly similar for the where string. I say if the query operator is not none, in other words, if we selected none, then I don't want to add a where criteria for that field. So if we have 5 fields and only one of them has an actual operator, then only one where statement should be added. So I'm saying for each one of these wrapper entities, if the field operator, if the query operator is not none, then I do the exact same thing. If this is the first where statement, if the where statement string is null at this point, then let's add to the where statement the name of the API field, then the operator value that we had, which is going to be that value we selected, the bigger than, the smaller than, and so on, and the query value. And if we already had one, I'm going to take the original value, add the word end, because we obviously need end between them, right? Right now we of course just use ends. We haven't added the ability to do an or if we wanted. But then exactly the same thing as the one above it. So dynamically, I'm creating a list of fields that we want to query, and I'm creating a list of where statements that we want to use. And finally, all I have to do is marry them. So I can say this is the final query string, and I say select all the fields we identified from our object. And then I do another check and I say, hey, let's check first, do we even have any where statements? What if all the all the fields we selected have no operators? Then I don't want to add where because it will be empty after that. So I say only if we have some where statements, take the final query string and add the where clause and all the where statements after that. And that's what gives us, we can see here, here's the fields, ID, account number, site, active, and number of employees, all separated by commas. Here's my where statement, ID equals test, and number of employees, something is obviously missing here, 1. And then my final statement is where we married both of these together with the select from the object and the where statement. So I think this is a pretty good stopping point. Let's just go over this one more time. So nothing has changed in the selecting here. We've changed this to a multi-select, and we changed the selecting variable from a single string to a list of strings. We created a new button that picks up that list and adds it to a list of a custom class that allows us to contain multiple values together. And then we allow the user to make a selection, whether it's equal or smaller than, and then we can click query. Now this is going to break because we can do smaller than on a source, but it will still give us a debug statement. We can see how we took all those fields, all those variables, all of these operators, and we made this actual query statement that we can then use in our database.query dynamic SOQL. Okay, with that, I think it's time to ask if you guys have any questions. So my goal is to really work together to build a page that is something that you could eventually take and use in your organization if you have a need. And at the very least, we'll have a lot of components that you are able to take and implement in your code that you will need to develop going forward. So, you know, I'm trying to build little sections every time, and also introduce new concepts every week. Because, you know, of course, it's never ending, right? I mean, it's not like we can say, okay, a month from now or 2 months from now or even 6 months from now, we'll know everything there is to know about VisualForce or Apex because A, there is an insane amount of knowledge to be had, and B, Salesforce continues evolving and adding new functionality to the platform. So the biggest thing that I can say is you usually just go ahead, try to figure out what you're trying to do, and Google is your friend. Right? I keep saying that because a lot of times when I go and develop something, I have no clue how to do it. And as long as you understand how to do these things and what's available to you and what tools are available, you can learn these things on your own once you have a pretty good understanding. So, Luke, anything to add? Or Bill?
Nope. I'm excited about where this is going, and I do see it as being something useful, a nice sort of quick version of reporting, especially a quick version of updating in those situations where perhaps inline list views can't solve the same purpose.
Right. I mean, the limitation usually around list views make it relatively complicated, though not impossible to do a mass update, right? I mean, if you have list views normally don't allow you to do inline editing if you have different record types, right?
Yeah, they're made very safe for a broad, uninformed end user community. But as admins, sometimes we wish that we could sort of override those safeties because we know what we're doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you have different record types, the challenge is that you may have different values in a pick list for each record.
Right.
Right. And so this makes it a lot more complicated to build a page that allows you to only select in a mass update format only values that you can. Right? How can you say, hey, I want to update to select these 10 records and update the pick list value on all of them to this value if maybe one of them is a different record type that doesn't support that value?
That's a good point.
So you can return an error, or you can find out different original ways to deal with something like this, but the reality, that's why list views don't allow you to do that.
Right. That and then the limitation that the field has to be on the page layout that to which your profile has been assigned. And so many times I've just quickly edited the page layout, put the field on there for myself, done the edit, and then taken it back off.
Exactly.
This is really good stuff, Ohad. Food for thought.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully we will get to meet again 2 weeks from today. I apologize, I had to do 3 weeks from the last time because I was traveling last week and I was not able to do that, but I should be available 2 weeks from today, and with that I will bid you all adieu, farewell and good night. Thank you for joining, and I will send out a follow-up email by tomorrow morning with a link to the gist that has this code so you can start playing with it and doing whatever the hell you want. Good night.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Ohad.